Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Continuity Insights 2023, Educating Executives and ERM Personnel on Business Continuity. I'm Jennifer Getz, the Editorial Director of Continuity Insights, and this webinar is presented by Riskonnect. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. Our speakers are on video today for their discussion, and if you would like to view them at the top of your screen, look for the bar in your window to pull down so they are visible to you. Next, please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions via the question box at any time. There will be a Q&A portion after this discussion, so please type your questions in there to send them to us. If at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send us a message via that question section and someone on our team will answer you privately. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of your control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel, so please be sure the panel is expanded so you can access the question box. And now I'll introduce your speakers. John Verdi is the Senior Director of Professional Services for Business Continuity and Resilience at Riskonnect. In his current role, John is privileged to lead the high-performing global teams of business continuity and resilience consultants and software implementation experts. Prior to leading the BCR professional services practice, John's career consisted of leading some of Riskonnect's most challenging and complex consulting engagements. Ian Evans is the lead solutions consultant with Riskonnect. He works with many of Riskonnect's biggest and most complex clients to help them drive up the effectiveness and efficiency of their GRC practices spanning ERM, controls management, regulatory compliance, and internal audit solutions. Welcome, Ian and John. Thank you for being here with us today.
All right, thank you so much for having us. So first and foremost, just from an agenda perspective, we'll talk through a little bit of why we chose this topic and why we're here today. I think this is a good one that will engage both the BC professionals and those that are tasked with engaging with some of their ERM counterparts. From there, we'll turn it over to my counterpart here, Ian Evans, to talk about enterprise risk management. We'll do a little primer for the business continuity professionals. From there, Ian will also talk about how ERM professionals tend to think about risks and controls. And then we'll look at the connections and intersections between business continuity and ERM and how they kind of feed off each other and what the interplay looks like there. And finally, we'll finish up with how does the business continuity program outputs and how do they inform the broader ERM journey? And also vice versa, how does the ERM journey tend to influence some of the BC program inputs as well as outputs? And as was mentioned, we will definitely save some time for some Q&A. So on the next slide here, just a little bit about who Riskonnect is. So Riskonnect is the leading integrated risk management software solution provider. Our technology empowers organizations with the ability to anticipate, manage, and respond in real time to strategic and operational risks across the extended enterprise. In July of last year, Riskonnect announced the acquisition of Castellon to better fulfill the ultimate goal of bringing risk under one roof. And together, Riskonnect will help you build integrated risk management functions with end-to-end visibility and true enterprise resilience through software, consulting, and our managed services. So with that, let's move to why this topic. So why did we choose to speak about this here today? I know as BC professionals, we can sometimes struggle to articulate how our efforts should tie together within the broader ERM framework within any organization. We also can appreciate that the level of coordination between the ERM function and business continuity that can vary based off the organization in terms of how mature their ERM practice is, some that are very mature and some that are just starting on their ERM journey. So what we're hoping that you'll be able to take away from this presentation is that we'll provide you as BC professionals with a better understanding of how to deliver that business continuity value prop to the ERM side of the house as well as the executive team, and how the information can and should flow freely between the two efforts. Because again, as I mentioned before, they both can inform each other and enhance the effort on both sides. So with that, I believe I will turn it over to Ian to talk a little bit about what is ERM.
Great, thanks, John. So before I move on to ERM, I just want to pick up on that first bullet point. If you feel you're one of the business continuity professionals possibly struggling with articulating how these things come together, let me assure you, you are not alone. We are all grappling at currently with how the whole space of what we call governance, risk and compliance, GRC for short, is evolving and converging and so on. So, and this covers far more than enterprise risk business continuity. It covers some of the items on the previous slide where we talked about policies and internal audit and compliance and ESG and other aspects of GRC that's emerging. So we're all in this together. It's a journey of discovery. So welcome aboard, and hopefully you'll find this presentation helpful. For today, of course, we will only be talking about enterprise risk management and business continuity. So let's start with a simple definition. This is taken from Richard Steinberg's excellent book on governance, risk and compliance. And it's one I particularly like because it does emphasize two particular things. One is the holistic nature of this. We are talking about enterprise level in its entirety. We're not talking about silos. We're not talking about project risks or other types of risks. We are talking about enterprise risk holistically across the organization. Another aspect of this definition, which I particularly like, is the association with corporate objectives. So as I say, there are project risks, there are team level risks, there are all sorts of types of risks out there. So what do we mean when we talk about enterprise risks in particular? We are talking about the organization. Organizations effectively are driven by their strategy, their vision, and of course by corporate objectives. And these corporate objectives can encompass financial stability, competitiveness, growth targets, service delivery, customer experience and retention, legal and regulatory, reputational, and various other things that matter significantly to the organization. So that's when we talk about enterprise risk management, that's where we pitch it, and it's essentially at the heart, or we see it as the heart of the GRC, the governance, risk and compliance piece. Enterprise risk is particularly important for at least two reasons. First of all, it is good business practice to manage your risks. Secondly, of course, many organizations, most large organizations, have a regulatory duty to report particularly their material risks, and there's an expectation therefore that organizations manage those material risks and understand their exposure and so on. So let's then go to what we mean by risk. I'm going to lay my cards on the table here and point out that whereas sometimes we think of risk with negative connotations, something to be avoided wherever possible. I'd like to stress the point that actually risk is good. Risk invariably usually leads to positive outcomes. Certainly without risk we don't get positive outcomes. We need to take risk. It's an integral part of being in business. Risk leads to progress, sometimes with some trial and error, but nevertheless with some progress. It leads to innovation, transformation, evolution, growth, all these good things. And depending on how well we manage our risks, it can also lead to competitive advantage. We can be smart at how we manage risk and how much risk we take on. Lack of risk taken, of course, or aversion to risk generally leads to stagnation and decline. So risk should be seen in a healthy perspective. But of course, what matters then is that that we must manage that risk. It's important that we manage that risk. And what do we mean by risk management, and particularly from an enterprise risk management perspective? So first of all, there is a risk exposure. We need to understand what our risk exposure is. How well do we understand our risk exposure? We've all lived through the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where banks took on significantly more risk, or they weren't aware of their risk, or for various cultural reasons, they knew full well how much their risk was. Whatever the reasons were, we need to understand our risk exposure and decide and determine as best we can, have we taken on too much risk out? Have we taken on enough risk? Where do we draw the line? And a lot of that then hinges on our risk appetite, of course. So risk appetite comes down to a number of things, but we all are aware of entrepreneurial organizations who perhaps are more risk receptive than other organizations, and that's a part of the nature of being entrepreneurial, of course. It's not a bad thing. In many ways, it's a good thing because it leads to success and growth, as I said. And often in those organizations, there is a positive risk culture. We may be saying a bit more about risk culture later, but risk culture comes into play here as well. Risk appetite statements are often soft words on a page talking about our risk posture, about how open we are and receptive we are to risks within reason, and so on. Tolerance levels are more precise or granular about where should we draw the line and how much risk can we afford to take on. When we talk about taking on risk, we do not mean in a cavalier way in any way. Even the most successful entrepreneurial organizations are not cavalier with risk. They manage risk. Risk is every much part of what they do every day. So these things come into play. Take on the right risks as well, mindful of our objectives. We do not want to be taking on risks that don't advance our objectives, our goals, our strategies, and so on. So often we have to be selective on what risks we take on. Sometimes we have to avoid certain risks or reject them, or even transfer them through insurance or hedge mechanisms and so on. So there's the different risk treatment strategies that we have, but when we take them on, first of all, we need to ensure that we understand their impacts and their likelihoods. So these are common terms within the enterprise risk management space. Importantly, a lot of this comes down to accountability then, and responsibility and ownership of the risks. And at enterprise level, that is a significant responsibility. I found that I've been a risk owner, sorry, in the past without even being aware of it. My name appeared in a spreadsheet somewhere and I wasn't even aware. At enterprise risk level, it carries huge responsibility because you are accountable to the board or the risk committee or whoever, the stakeholders and so on. And managing risk, mitigating risk often requires significant budget. At enterprise risk level, when we mitigate risks, we are often talking about budgets in the millions, tens of millions of dollars, whatever. It's big money, and that money has to be secured from a CFO who has tight purse strings and so on. So it requires a lot of seniority sometimes, but also a responsibility to ensure that we are making sensible decisions about mitigating those risks. So when we have mitigations in place, we often talk about mitigating controls, and we'll be saying a bit more about that in a moment. So we talk about controls and ensuring that our controls then are effective, whether they are implemented effectively or they are operating effectively. And we rarely talk about risks without also talking about controls. So more on that in a moment, as I say. And then importantly, it's the monitoring side of this. Are we on top of things? What is our risk exposure? What risks are emerging further down the line, and do we understand them, and are we managing them effectively? Are we ready for them? But also looking at day-to-day things like actions. What's going on out there? Who's managing things to mitigate risks? What about events? What about near misses? Various incidents that are out there. These all play into how effectively we manage our risks. Okay, so a little bit more about risks and controls, and introducing that, if you haven't seen it before, the concept of a bow tie, named for obvious reasons, but I quite like this depiction of controls in this respect, because it's memorable. You can memorize this. It's recognizable, but the concept of an event having causes on the left-hand side and outcomes. Consequences on the right side, and causes can have sub-causes and so on, so you can do root cause analysis and understand what causes a cause and so on, and you can trace that back however far you want to go. But you can then start thinking about the controls, the mitigations that you need to put in to prevent as far as possible an event from occurring. Obviously what you're doing here is reducing the likelihood of an event occurring, but it's the causes on the left hand side of the bow tie, whereas on the right hand side you can see then the more defensive, the corrective actions. What do we do when things happen? We know that sooner or later something bad will happen, and we have to be prepared for it. And I think already that's starting to paint a picture in my mind, certainly, of where enterprise risk and business continuity and resilience come together. You can see that on the right hand side, that's largely, as I would see it, certainly from an ERM perspective, where business continuity comes into play. And we often talk in ERM world about preventive controls, detective controls, corrective controls, as well as directive controls. The directive ones being instructive and policy and training and so on, and supervisory type of roles. Whereas I needn't list them out, but the preventive controls prevent. Detective means you can spot something bad that's happened as quickly as possible, then you can respond to it. The industry has many control frameworks as well that you may have heard about, and organizations often use these to demonstrate their coverage of controls and areas, particularly in IT, which is mostly my background. So you will have heard of NIST perhaps, and ISO 27001. These are examples of control frameworks, but many organizations, most organizations also have in-house controls, and these are managed effectively as possible. So also on this slide, I'm showing typical enterprise risks. So these are financial control failures, major service outages, and so on. You may recognize some of these. These are typical enterprise risks that we regularly see in organizations' risk registers. On the right-hand side, top right, we have the risk management activities of identification, ownership, and assessment, and so on. If you recognize those, you may be familiar with the ISO 31000 family of standards, which sets out risk management. So for me, I think just if you remember anything from this slide, remember the bow tie. I think it helps sort of join up the preventative and the defensive recovery corrective side of this picture, and hopefully even from there you can see that enterprise and business continuity are two sides of the same coin in many respects. Okay, and on that note, really, as we look at the corrective side of this, probably that's a good point then to hand back to John, who will say a little bit more about the business continuity side of this.
Okay. And Ian, actually, right before we go on this, do you want to say anything about risk culture, or should I just hop right in? Up to you.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but yes, absolutely. Risk culture is one of those things that sort of permeates, doesn't it? It's out there, and it's often overlooked, but it is integral to effective enterprise risk management and the disciplines all around it, whether it's compliance, audit, whatever, and our commitment to mitigating risk, understanding them, and so on. And I think everybody would see, you know, that risk culture often is established from the top, and it permeates from there. So we often look at our senior management as to how risk is treated and managed within the organization, and that has a massive effect then on our attitude to risk, if we see it positively or negatively or whatever. So absolutely, it's a big thing.
Yep. So I apologize. I'm making Ian drive through some very crude arrows I put on this slide here, so we'll breeze through these a little quickly. But from the risk culture standpoint on the ERM side, you can see how that correlates to, from a business continuity perspective, you know, we're very concerned about our product and service downtime tolerance. And that kind of serves as our North Star for how we build the program going forward, right? And what capability we build to. The business goals, strategy, policies, objectives, all the things inherent in ERM, I would argue also tie directly to product and service downtime tolerance, but those can feed our governance when you think about a business continuity charter, business continuity policy, standard operating procedures. All of that is going to be a subset of what the business has already thought about from an ERM perspective. Now, flip it on its head, if they're in a less mature organization, it can kind of go the other way with business continuity, informing some of what that could look like, or at least the initial build out. Certainly risk appetite. ties directly to the product and service downtime tolerance. What is our organization's posture towards risk is certainly going to influence kind of the, another way to look at downtime tolerance is what is the level of impact on the customer we're willing to tolerate. That customer could be internal, it could be external, it could be the market in total, but what is that risk appetite and what do we need to be able to build a capability to recover by? Risk exposure and risk identification and assessment, both those very cleanly tied to our business impact analysis and risk assessment. This is where we're doing the deep dive into the business. We all know as BC professionals here, identifying what our risks are and what our exposure is, and then we can kind of move to the next step, which is the last bullet here. But before I reach that, the other piece around risk ownership, Ian mentioned it earlier. So being assigned a risk. So a risk needs to be managed. It needs to be tracked, reported on. You know, the business needs to have visibility on that. So from an ERM perspective, maybe this is logged in a risk register. Same within a business continuity program. However, how is this being tracked and reported on from accountability perspective? We tend to encourage customers to do at least quarterly management reviews around the business continuity program and surfacing some of the risks. Even if those tend to be risks that we have accepted, still revisiting those at a predefined cadence to ensure that our tolerance as a business hasn't slipped to a point where we need to reevaluate what we want to do with that risk. And then the last piece, so risk treatment. In the ERM world, you hear kind of the 4 T's. Where are we going to treat the risk, tolerate the risk, transfer the risk, or terminate the risk? So that's inherent in our strategy selection piece of business continuity. And the next slide is very similar to this. I'll talk through it a little bit more, but probably through a lens we're all comfortable seeing. But our risks, how are we going to deal with those? That's our strategy selection piece. Then building those out at the kind of the next step down in procedures and business continuity plans and crisis management plans. And then lastly, testing and exercising, making sure that those strategies we've put in place and those procedures that we've written out still allow us to achieve the objectives that we need, which is continuing to be able to deliver our products and services within a predefined period of time. With that said, Ian, if you don't mind going to the next slide here. So as I mentioned, pretty much saying the same thing, but I think this representation helped drive it home a little bit more for me too, as a business continuity professional. So those boxes in orange across the middle should look familiar to everybody. Startup may be an outlier, and I'll talk to startup in a minute, but doing analysis, your BIAs, strategy, planning, exercising, and then that cycle of continual improvement, that should all look very familiar. When we talk about startup, what we're looking at there is really the frame meeting. And I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide about what the frame meeting is. But if you look in the boxes down below, again, I'm tying all those same ERM concepts to the various stage of the program where we're at. So obviously the risk culture, business goals, strategy, objectives, so on, and the organization's risk appetite is going to feed the startup phase of the program build. That allows us to build a really sound foundation on which the program is built on. It also ensures that we're building a business continuity program aligned with the organization's top level view of like enterprise risk. From there, with that North Star in place, we can then move into the analysis phase where we're identifying our risks and performing our assessments, our BIAs, and identifying what that exposure is. So coming out of that, you know, we have our foundation, we have our blueprint for how the business operates and where our risk is. And then from there, it's the 4 T's again. So the risk treatment, are we going to treat, tolerate, transfer, or terminate? And that is what is discussed kind of in our strategy phase. So how do we want to address the risks at hand? Maybe there are some we want to treat. There's some that we're just willing to tolerate and move on. But whatever that may be, once our strategy is decided on, we then decompose that strategy into procedures that are actionable in our plans, and then we test them through exercising. And again, as mentioned before previously, for those longer term risks, they're assigned owners, they're continually tracked, reported on from an accountability perspective, and the business continuity steering committee or the organization's risk committee overall has a consistent view of how we're managing our risks across the organization. You want to take it to the next one, Ian? So I mentioned the concept of a frame meeting. So frame is just what we at Riskonnect refer to setting the foundation of the program or framing the business continuity program. So how can we use the frame process to actually define some of the ERM related concepts? So let me just talk about that a little bit more. So in a frame meeting, what essentially we're doing is we're getting leadership aligned on 4 key questions, which are in the red boxes here. Why is business continuity important to the business? This aligns to kind of our program objectives. So key drivers, expectations of the program, so on and so forth. What should we be trying to protect? This is our products and services that are in scope. There may be some products and services within the business that are not on the critical path, maybe legacy products and such, that are going to get treated differently. So what is the scope of the program we're trying to protect? How much business continuity is necessary? This is another way of saying downtime tolerance or level of impact on the customer we're willing to tolerate. And the final question of who is sponsoring, leading, and participating in the business continuity program. So the first one obviously maps to the business continuity policy. And if we think about the policy, the business continuity policy is essentially the what and the why of the program. So while the program objectives are certainly in the policy, if you move over to the right here, also, once we know what the program scope is and what our risk tolerance is, that feeds our program policy as well. And so if the business continuity policy is your what and your why, then your standard operating procedures are your how or your roadmap for how we build the program, how we manage it, how we maintain and evolve the program over time. So who's sponsoring and leading, that feeds roles, responsibilities in the standard operating procedures. So why I highlight all of this, is what we do at the beginning of a business continuity program build out is for organizations that have a mature ERM practice, many of these questions may have already been thought through, and now we just need to take that and translate it to the world of business continuity, translating the risk culture and the risk appetite of the organization and translating that into product and service downtime tolerance based on strategy, goals, so on and so forth. But again, all this is tied back to the organization's risk culture, risk appetite, goals, strategy, objectives, and policies. On the flip side of that, for organizations without a mature ERM practice or maybe just getting started on their journey, but they also have a mature business continuity program, answers to these questions can also seed a lot of the foundational work for the ERM initiative as well, because we're talking about things at a high level from a product and service level and how we address it as a business going forward based on our overall risk appetite. Ian, if you want to go to the next one here. So after we've gotten out of our frame stage, so now, again, this should look familiar to all of our business continuity practitioners, but performing a business impact analysis for risk identification. But again, with that BIA, as we're scoping it out, it's always good to do this from a top-down approach. And the top-down, again, organizational strategy, objectives, culture, product, service, revenue, profitability, strategic value, client or regulatory legal requirements. All of these things can drive the prioritization of our products and services. But the bottom line is, coming out of that frame meeting that we just discussed, we should know what are we trying to protect and what is the tolerance for downtime and level of impact on the customer that we're willing to tolerate. So as the BIA or as BC practitioners, we know that a BIA is where we're going to identify our risks. We're going to identify what our exposure looks like based on the outcomes of the business impact analysis and risk assessment. But again, importantly, those high-level concepts from an ERM perspective or from a frame perspective are going to allow us to understand our product and service scope, our downtime tolerance, and then from there, we're off and running on our business impact analysis, performing BIAs at a department or business function level. Sitting underneath those is your business activities, and then all the dependencies that come with it, your personnel, your technology, your suppliers, facilities, so on and so forth. So I think what's important to highlight for non-business continuity related practitioners is what is coming out of the business impact analysis and risk assessment. It's a very rich data set that comes out that can drive a lot of good decision making that needs to happen next in the strategy phase here. So with that, Ian, can you go to the next slide, please? Oop. All right, so using the BIA to develop strategies for risk treatment. So again, as BC practitioners, we know what comes out of a business impact analysis and risk assessment. So we have what are our high level risks, in some cases are very detailed risks based off the analysis that we've done, and some potential recommendations we have for remediating some of those risks. We also get recovery priorities and timelines, hearing from the business, those with firsthand experience of operating day in, day out, what are our actual priorities and what the timeline should look like at a much more granular level. While leadership's looking at kind of the top level product and service, now we're talking at a business activity or a business function level. And then we also understand very granularly our specific resource requirements and our single points of failure. So coming out of that, that's a very powerful set of data that will then drive our strategy discussions. And those strategy discussions correlate, again, directly to the ERM speak for risk treatment, that treat, tolerate, transfer, and terminate. So from a strategy perspective, we have our risks and recommendations, and that allows us to understand what are our organizational recovery strategies and what does the response structure look like from a department level, a site level, a business unit level. How do we structure our business to respond and recover from a disruptive event? Our recovery priorities and timelines up in the middle section for the BIA. What does that feed? Well, that feeds our product and service recoverability, and it also gives us some metrics to move off of. So when you think about metrics that can come from a product and service level, think about what is probably a familiar concept of a committed recovery time objective versus a proven recovery time objective, either through a real world event or a test. But by knowing what we've committed to as a business and what's possible, we understand, can we meet that capability or do we have a gap? And that's very powerful information to be able to provide to our leadership to enable other decision making. And then lastly, on the strategy piece is with those resource requirements and single points of failure we're gathering, we're able to understand what are our strategy mitigation options, and very tactically, what are our manual workarounds? Where can we work in an alternate means for a short amount of time while we're recovering whatever the disruption has caused. So following strategy, we've set our direction. We've chosen from an ERM speak to treat, tolerate, transfer, or terminate a risk. And then we decompose those again into our plans in some actionable procedures from our BC plans, as well as driving it into our crisis management efforts. So I think a final takeaway from the last couple slides before we summarize for everyone here is when you're speaking to ERM professionals or executives, a lot of time the focus is on the business continuity plan. Just show me the plan. What's the plan? How are we going to address this? I would counter that with the plan is very important. Obviously, that's our procedures for how we address, respond, and recover from an incident. But what I would say is that a plan is also just evidence that we've worked through the process of identifying or analyzing our business, understanding our risks, selecting strategies to address those risks that align to the organization's risk appetite, and then we've built plans off of those. So I think if you took away one thing from this is the ability to summarize everything that a program does and how that feeds back in over to the ERM side. It's not just about a business continuity plan. With that, I will pause for a moment. Ian, anything to add on this slide or the last couple slides?
No, a number of points, John, you've brought out, though, that shows commonality, definitely around the terminology about appetite and exposure, and you mentioned the 4 Ts. There's so much common ground between us, and ultimately, as we're seeing, the business continuity and resilience is effectively how we manage certain enterprise risks. I mean, there's so much alignment there. Maybe with business continuity, we see greater emphasis on the exercising side. You talk about business impact analysis, BIAs. Similarly, in the enterprise world, we do extensive risk assessments, and it's an iterative thing here because you talk about reevaluation and the same with risks. We're constantly reassessing risks and looking for emerging risks and so on, and keeping on top of things. Nothing stands still, and it's the same whether you're talking about enterprise risk or business continuity. It's a moving feast, and we have to be on top of it constantly.
All right, so let's move to the last one here, and then we can open it up for questions after this. So I think a couple things to take away is that there's a number of points of synergy between the business continuity efforts and ERM efforts. Data can flow both ways and should flow both ways between the programs, both informing and reinforcing the elements of the ERM and business continuity efforts. We didn't really talk about it a lot over the course of this presentation, but I think, again, something that can be inferred here from this is operating in silos here is a recipe for misalignment, one, probably most simply. A lot of duplication of efforts, noting the analysis that we're doing, the analysis being done on the other side, the strategy discussions, even the top level discussions around kind of what our risk posture or risk appetite is in total as an organization. And then finally, probably the most troubling is possibly having contradictory outputs. And you say, well, how do you have contradictory outputs? The business is what the business is. But if you start with a different North Star, meaning, the ERM initiative has kind of thrown off these key objectives based off of this business strategy and whatnot, and your business continuity effort is not aligned to that, you're working off two different North Stars, and it may be even a slight deviation, but if you move far enough down that path, that gap grows pretty wide here. So I think a takeaway for ERM professionals is collaborating with their BC counterparts can yield a ton of great information, a lot of great depth and rich information about the risks and the risk detail, as well as going the extra step of providing those risk mitigation recommendations and options for leadership to evaluate on what they want to do in terms of addressing those risks. And I think on the business continuity side for our BC professionals, collaborating with their ERM counterparts can provide a lot of great top-level strategic guidance that is often missing when you're starting out, a greenfield business continuity program in an organization. A lot of times there's pressure to just get in and start showing, quick wins, and that is going in and kind of diving into a business impact analysis and getting moving on traditional BC lifecycle type activities. But taking that extra step to ensure that the business continuity program is aligned to the larger ERM effort right out of the gate will yield dividends. And on the flip side of that, as we mentioned before, if an organization is less mature and does not have an ERM program in place, or they're just starting out on that journey, a lot of this work, if it's been done previously around the frame piece and having those higher level discussions around risk appetite, risk culture, product and service downtime tolerance, a lot of that can be used as a great input and starting point to some of the ERM initiatives. So with that, Ian, anything else before we open it up for Q&A?
No, you covered a lot of things there, John. Thank you. I just wanted to sort of repeat and emphasize certain things you said there about data and alignment. A lot of this comes down to interconnectedness. Everything is interconnected, and what executives need is that holistic picture again of everything. How all of this joins up. What risks are we exposed to? What is our readiness? How effective are our controls? How ready are our business continuity plans? Our communication plans, and who's going to leap into action if and when something goes wrong, and all the follow-up then about issues and actions and everything else that comes into play there. So you're right, there's so much data generated there, and having that holistic view, the visibility of how the business is managing all of that from one place, as opposed to in silos, to stress that point as well, is the holy grail here. That's what we're all aspiring to and working in that direction.
All right. Well, thank you, Ian. With that, I think we can open it up for questions and take it from there.
All right. Well, John, Ian, thank you so much for this informative presentation, and thank you to all attendees for sending in questions. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of this presentation to address the questions that you have sent in, and please continue to submit any questions that you may have. Okay, so to get started, the first question I would like to ask is, this is not exactly ERM related, but what's the best way to define the difference between RTO and MTD/MAD to senior leadership?
I think I'll go ahead and take a stab at this one here, but I think, your maximum allowable downtime tolerance, when you think about it when speaking with leadership, the way I like to talk about it is, at what point do we cry? which is, we're impacted as a business, but we can continue to operate, versus at what point do we die? That's a very extreme way of articulating that, but it allows us to set, from a leadership perspective, some kind of goalpost of where we need to be, or at what point do we really, one, at cry, need to be very concerned, and at die is we're ready to realize a significant impact to our business, potentially a catastrophic impact to the business. The recovery time objectives should be set as such that we're not exceeding those, right? So like, how do we get back to operation, or at least to a minimum capability to allow us to operate before we hit certainly that die, and probably before we hit that cry point? Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Perfect. Okay, so another question we have here is, where does disaster recovery fit in business continuity?
So John, is that you as well?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, it's right hand and left hand, right? So you can't really have one without the other. So while from a business continuity perspective, we're focused a little bit more broadly, from an ITDR perspective, when we do a business impact analysis, we're talking to the business about requested recovery time objectives for mission critical business applications. That is then transferred over to our ITDR team, or in some cases maybe one and the same, but they're basically tasked with architecting recovery capability to be able to enable the business to meet that. And I think at the same time, where a lot of businesses struggle is they treat these things similarly in silos, and business continuity is gathering these requirements and then lobbing it over the fence to the ITDR team that says, there's no way we're going to build to this capability. The cost far exceeds the benefit. So a much better method of operation, I believe, and I think most would agree, is ITDR and business continuity teams working hand in hand, that as we're going out gathering requirements from the business, IT is given a chance to push back and challenge those assumptions and state why. There's cases where the business will say the toaster oven in the break room is mission critical, right? So it's, at some point, we need to have a little bit of a sanity check and weights and balance to that. And I think so. Hopefully that answers the question, but I think the summary of that is that they go hand in hand and they should be working together very, very closely.
Perfect. Okay, another question we have here is, enterprise level risks are generally kept close to the vest by senior leaders. So how can you ensure alignment with department level BC efforts?
Do you want to attempt that, John, or shall I?
yeah, no, I can.
Yeah.
I think that's where we talk about the frame meeting, is really where we're able to gather that sort of information. So how we see a frame meeting typically playing out in an organization is, before going into that frame meeting, which is with your senior leadership, ideally. If you can't get the senior leadership, then with their direct delegates. But the idea is to get 60 to 90 minutes of their time. Now, before then, you have your homework to do, which is to go through and doing analysis on the business. How does leadership talk about products and service? In a very small organization that maybe manufactures one product line, it could be as simple as, we look at the business as our ability to take an order, make an order, ship an order. However, in a large, complex, multinational business with hundreds or thousands of SKUs, you need to start looking at segmentation of your products and services. So it's important to understand, how does your leadership think about these products and services? And then how does your leadership evaluate not just the product and service from a financial standpoint? That's almost the easy part, is looking at the dollars and cents to it. The other part is looking at reputational impact of the inability to deliver the product, downstream operational impacts, legal and contractual impacts. In some of the the healthcare world, patient health and safety impacts. So getting that time with leadership, as you said, it is stuff that's kept close to the vest, but in order to drive a really effective business continuity program, they're going to have to be willing to share some of that information with you to help at least set you on your way to prioritization. So the frame meeting is where, once you've done your homework, you can go in front of your leadership team and say, our business operates as follows. get a sanity check for sure. But then from that point is, okay, so how do we want to start thinking about product and service downtime tolerance and let them guide you from there? And so again, that should be informed by those higher level ERM discussions and risks. Anything to add to that one?
Yeah, so from an enterprise risk, turn it on its head. I mean, senior management keeping risk close to their chest, I think was one of the statements in the question. It's back to a point I raised earlier. I could sort of bring in the fact that risk ownership is set at senior level, but taking risk ownership seriously requires that the right mitigation strategy is enacted and taken forward. It's a serious responsibility where the mitigation requires some form of business continuity planning and analysis and exercising and so on. That has to be part of your response strategy, as well as mitigating or reducing the likelihood of that occurring, which is always an important factor. Being prepared for almost the inevitable and having effective plans in place with exercised, rehearsed, and so on. Communication plans and everything else is an integral part of the enterprise risk management treatment. So again, it has to be viewed not just from the business continuity trying to tap into the enterprise risk, but the enterprise risk being joined up. It's that ownership factor and engaging the right people to ensure that it's properly managed.
All right, perfect. And before we move ahead, Ian, would you mind moving to the next slide? Perfect, just so we can see your contact information if they want to reach out with any other questions. But here's another question for you to answer right now. Can this synergy create an output such as a better / much improved risk analysis? And how about horizon scan critical development? Thank you.
I'll give at least the business continuity view here, and then Ian, if you want to piggyback off any of that. But I think, yeah, how could it improve the analysis piece? Ian talked a little bit about at the top level the different types of risks to the business, and almost kind of listing them off, thinking about them like from on the US side of things, looking at like a 10K, like the different types of regulatory risk, legal risk, operational risk, so on and so forth. What I think the business continuity program in tandem does really well is it allows us to get down to a level of a single business activity and say, what is the impact to the business of not being able to perform that activity within a department, within a business unit that supports a product and service. So it gets really granular, and we look at those risks all through the same lens. We're looking at financial impact for sure, but operational impact, legal, regulatory, again, patient health and safety, if that's applicable. So I think it just adds another layer of granularity to those top level risks. So you can kind of drill down into those as far as you can, because while it's great to look at the risk at the top level, in a lot of cases, you're addressing it from the bottom up. So that's my take.
Yeah, and from an enterprise perspective, then when we talk about risks and controls, we've focused on that primarily on this call, but behind all of that, then we have all the business processes. A big part of when we implement an ERM solution, we are looking at how the risks align not just with controls, but with objectives we've mentioned, but also business processes. And business processes often is where controls are designed in or applied to those processes. And processes can comprise obviously steps in some activities, some business activity, often supported by IT applications, technology, and so on, and indeed controls and risks of failure of technology come into play there. So very often the risk assessment goes down into extra layers of business processes, resources around that, not just IT applications, but people and third parties as well, and all these things come into play, which again is all part of that big picture governance, risk, and compliance that we mentioned earlier on. So having that interconnected view from your enterprise risks across all of the business, so that you know if a particular application fails, what are the consequences on the business process. Very often, by taking out a business process for a few minutes, let alone a few hours or a few days, can have a major adverse effect on the business. Understanding that and having that information at your fingertips is crucial. Doing the analysis then behind that enriches that picture, so everybody knows what the consequences are and what appropriate actions should be taken.
Perfect, thank you. Another question we have here is, what is a good approach to the BIAs that you would suggest? For example, would you suggest that there be a separate BIA for finance, payroll, and finance purchasing, or would you create a BIA for finance to include these work areas in one?
Ooh, I think it's a tough one without having context to the business overall. What I coach clients on a lot of times is start with the end in mind. So the business impact analysis allows us to understand how the business operates, the critical activities and dependencies that sit within the teams that are involved, all of it. So starting with the end in mind is, what are we going to do with that information? Well, we're going to build a business continuity plan that needs to be usable and actionable by the team. And so I think if you start with the end in mind, it becomes a little bit easier to say, okay, well, that same team, does it make sense that we're all operating off of the same plan? In some cases, the answer to that may be yes. In other cases, you may say these teams are so segmented and siloed that we don't need to concern ourselves with what this other team is doing. Let everyone operate independently. So I think there's a number of ways you could do it. In that case, maybe you split out individual plans, or maybe you have one plan for finance with department or functional specific annexes. So I guess sorry to dodge that one, but I guess the way I guess you would look at that best is, again, just start with the end in mind, and I think that will guide you to what's the best outcome, or what's the best way to approach the business impact analysis.
Great. So John, this is a question for you, it looks like. When BCM reports to an ERM department and the ERM professionals do not understand how business continuity works/operates, how do you politely tell them, the ERM, how it works/operates? This can be very difficult. This can be a very difficult task because ERM thinks they know how BC works.
Yep, I think this gets to that last question, or excuse me, that last statement I made of, it's more than just a plan, because I hear that time and time again from those that are not involved is, okay, so this team goes in and they build business continuity plans, and most people think they have an understanding of what sits all behind that. So I think the best way for them to understand, or for you to kind of inform them of it, is work on your elevator pitch for the program. What's your 30 seconds to a minute way to articulate what sits underneath that? And it's identification of your products and services and what that tolerance from downtime is based off business objectives. Then we go in, we do our analysis. I would talk to the level of analysis of what is done, strategy, recommendations, selection, and ultimate actioning, and then building into plans, and then exercising and testing. I think the other piece that they need to be aware of, again, it's a program, not a plan. So with having the program, you have a steering committee, you are managing your risk. And I think them understanding that it is not just a plan, it is a program, and that it's a living, breathing thing, and we're actively managing risk through it, should better engage the business on it and want them to actually participate in some fashion or another to understand, and not just be kind of a passive consumer of any data that comes out of it.
Perfect, thank you. Another question we have here is, executives often assign the responsibility for the business continuity program to the toppling pile of responsibilities the ERM team / person has. How do we convince the executive team that a strong BCM program requires a dedicated, qualified BCP professional?
Oof. I think probably, I see there's a little under 300 people on this call. There's probably every single person on there has felt this pain of doing more with less, or not getting the appropriate resources you need. So again, this is a battle that we have to fight all the time, and especially in today's climate with budgets getting tightened, it's tough. But I think if you can tie the business back to key business objectives or speak to it at a product and service level in a manner that resonates with leadership, it doesn't guarantee you the budget or the resourcing, but it at least allows you to plead your case. I've seen too many cases where business continuity professionals, maybe very tenured, 10, 20, 30 years in the business, get hung up in talking to leadership about very tactical, granular elements of a program, very activity and compliance-based metrics. We did X number of BIAs, X number of plans. In a lot of cases, that doesn't mean anything to them. They want to know, what is my ability to recover this product and service capability? So I think just being mindful to speak the language of leadership will help go a long way towards at least getting you a seat at the table for the discussion around budgeting and resourcing, but it's not a guarantee.
Can I add to that as well, John? In my experience, not so much from BC and ERM, but certainly from enterprise risk, having information, financial monetary information about your business at your fingertips. If there is a business continuity requirement associated with enterprise risk, it often helps persuade a CFO or other senior managers when you can demonstrate with hard numbers what the consequences might be if they don't support this activity or if it's not carried out effectively, and what the consequences therefore would be to the business. I've seen cases where a cyber attack has wiped out a business for many days on end, and that has business consequences. CFOs understand that language and would generally support it, but it's having that business information to hand to support your case. But yeah, I feel for everybody who's been in that position.
So it looks like we have time for one final question. What is the difference between a crisis management plan and business continuity plan in terms of contents?
So if you want to think about crisis management planning, and it can be done at different levels, depending on how your business is structured. But if you just take kind of a traditional, say like a manufacturing environment, just so everyone can wrap their head around that, a business continuity plan may be done at a department or a business function level. So maybe you have, you have your intake or your warehousing, you have your manufacturing, and then you have your shipping and logistics. And each one of those has their own business impact analysis, has their own plan, because the recovery of that function looks very different. What that crisis management plan should do is kind of serve as the umbrella that sits over top of all of the other response and recovery efforts, with representatives from those individual businesses, or excuse me, individual parts of the business represented on that crisis management team. What that allows for is good cross-functional recovery, because chances are if an impact to shipping and logistics, it doesn't just stay contained within shipping and logistics. There are impacts to other parts of the business that will have to respond and react accordingly. So allowing that cross-functional coordination, as well as allowing a place for resource requests to get surfaced in a structured manner, and then pushing down recovery, response and recovery, mandates or directives, if you will. So it allows just for efficient and effective communication across the organization or the part of a business in total. That would be the best way I would look at it. It's kind of the umbrella that sits over everything else.
All right, perfect. Thank you both so much for taking the time to answer these questions, and thank you to our audience for sending in questions. If we weren't able to address your questions at this time, we will share them with our speakers who will address it at a later time. John, Ian, again, thank you for the presentation today, and thank you to Riskonnect for sponsoring this webinar. A recording from today's session will be made available on our magazine's website, continuityinsights.com, and on riskonnect.com. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.